We'll just, I'll just, all right, Prime Minister, whenever.
Can we hear me all right? Is the audio
Yep,
okay?
yeah,
Okay,
I can hear
sorry.
you.
Um, I prefer verbal or camera POIs, please. I probably will not read the chat. The EU is at a pivotal moment in its existence where its existence is more important than necessary. And the worst thing to do at this moment be to force a bunch of poor countries who already resent us to do something that they hate a lot and don't care about that much. What are the EU's interests first? Probably stability and capacity to do other stuff. They probably care about the ability to keep Ukraine holding the line and prevent Russia from encroaching further on their territory. Also probably care about just existing and keeping as many members as possible in order to have as unified a front as possible on trade and economic front. I also think they probably care about climate change only a little bit among other priorities, and I'm going to get to the exact way of that later. But yes, this is a pivotal moment. They care a lot about support right now, specifically because there are multiple wars going on that are affecting their trade relationships, that are affecting their security as a set of nations. Having more nations to deal with this stuff is better than less. So yeah, just to clear things up, this is about directives and funding. So it's not just giving free money to countries, we're also forcing them to do stuff. I think something that's OP has to defend. That's our major issue with this. What are the likely alternatives to this? Probably each country decides on their own which climate change initiatives they want to happen. Probably some NGOs exist to give some nominal amount of funding to really poor countries who really want to be super green but don't care about it, but I don't think that matters too much. I'm going to prove two things to you today. I'm going to prove that this is inefficient and destabilizing, and I'm going to prove that this is basically useless because most of the impact is going to be gained on either side of the house anyways. Why is this inefficient and destabilizing? Number one, I think reducing climate change contributions is honestly quite unimportant for Europe compared to other priorities for a couple of reasons. One, the effects of climate change on Europe are going to be comparatively small and easy to mitigate. That is, they will probably experience higher temperatures and they'll probably experience a greater rate of natural disasters. But these things are quite easy to fix with a little bit of funding for AC and rebuilding a couple houses that are like, I don't know, erased in like earthquakes and stuff like that. Secondly, Europe isn't even in the top three emitters in the world. The US, China, and India all emit far more than it does because they tend to produce a lot more. They tend to like consume a lot more fuel, I don't know, in that process of production, and they tend to emit a lot more. Thus, it does not really matter that much what Europe does. I think anything Europe does to mitigate climate change is going to have a comparatively small effect. Even if this succeeds and every country in Europe just completely stops emitting by 2050, it's not going to matter because the temperature is going to go up anyways because the US and China and India have incentives to not do this because their entire economies are essentially based on the need to create stuff, which unfortunately requires them to pollute quite a lot. So I think that like at the end of the day, this is not a super efficient priority to pursue. I also think that this is really mean to small, poor countries. Number one, it's practically unfair. Some countries have no real industry to keep them going and are poor for that reason because their manufacturing or textile or whatever industries were taken over by China who can sell them for cheaper, or Vietnam, or whichever other country is currently out competing them. These countries still have to keep the lights on. They still have to keep their citizens going to school and to hospitals. And given that like it's a massive transition to go from oil-based economy to green economy, I don't think it is fair to force this on all of them because it's not just a matter of building a geothermal power plant and calling it a day. It's a matter of installing like train systems, do your transport of food and goods so that you don't have trucks doing it all the time. It's a matter of like changing the habits, I guess, of the corporations that do business with you, which is something that like a lot of these countries don't really have the influence, either rule of law wise or leverage wise economically to do. So practically not very nice to them. But more importantly, this is often really, really bad for the EU to do. Like starving rural Hungarians or whatever going to see the EU saying like, haha, sucks that you're starving, but keep taking in those refugees you hate, and here's a little money for a wind farm. This is going to make them feel that the EU is out of touch with their needs and does not care about them, because if they see money coming to the government and that money is not going directly to them, they're going to be offended by this. I think countries, this is the impact, are probably likely to leave, or at the very least, this fuels intense resentment for them. Many countries are already reaching a tipping point because the EU has asked a lot of them in recent years. They've been forced to take in refugees. They've been forced to take on economic losses incurred by stopping their partnerships with Russia, which were previously pretty useful to them. I think that like another forced, I guess, initiative is likely to be the tipping point for a lot of politicians who are running out of excuses for their citizens. But more importantly, since this initiative is so much more massive and all-encompassing than refugees or than like cutting a single trade route with Russia, I think its all-encompassingness or whatever is, its demand that we reorder the infrastructure of the country is much larger than previous asks, and that's another reason why it's likely to be the thing that causes the country to leave. And this is bad for a number of reasons. One, if anyone breaks and starts trading with Russia again, Belarus already, basically has from the start of the war. It's not possible. This is really bad. This basically mitigates the effect of the sanctions on them. This gives them a geopolitical advantage. That's not good. Also, the EU just has less power as a bloc, less authority, etc. Number two, I think that the effects of this initiative are mostly not mutually exclusive, because I think that the biggest and most important countries are going to pursue initiatives on their own anyways. And by biggest, I mean population-wise. Sure, we get like, oh yeah, I'll take POI.
Yeah, so why would countries leave when, they get most of their budget from the European Union, and when most of the products you can trade because of the European Union? There's larger benefits and no one cares you have to spend slightly extra on greening the
Because if Russia and China offer them better deals and promise not to encroach on their politics, that's probably like going to be pretty useful to them. I think Russia is in a position to trade with countries and not interfere with them. I think China is in the same position. Rose will explain this later. Why is this non-mutually exclusive? One, younger voters are increasingly concerned about climate change for a number of reasons. Education, NGO advertising, rising temperatures causing them to look into the phenomenon. It means that they vote in politicians who do these initiatives anyways. Number two, other commitment. Countries like France probably care about the Paris Agreement, and therefore probably are going to strive to fulfill that because they care about their reputations. And three, I think the turn from Russia at the start of the war that a lot of these countries did actually helped put them on the right path. A lot of countries who lost their oil sources and were forced to replace them somehow chose to go with greener energy because they understood that this was a more future-proofed option, i.e. see Germany's energy deal with Canada that led to them, doing a lot more green stuff. So I think this is a useless initiative and we should abandon it.
Thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Now to call on the Leader of Opposition to open up the opposing case.
Before I begin, POIs exclusively in the chat, please. Okay, a couple of responses to opening government, then we'll go into our case as to why this damages long-term buy-in for larger policies that the EU wants to do, and why climate change is pretty bad. Cool. Responses then. Firstly, they say, oh, this is bad because you're forcing some countries into doing this where they don't want to. Notably, at the point at which this debate has happened, this initiative has been in place for years. It's been in place since 2019, which means that there has already been consensus from these countries to already buy into this policy, so they're not being forced into doing it. But the second claim that they have is that, but like these small countries it's unfair for them to have this burden when they can't afford to do this. I think the way in which this works is that the subsidies and the way these initiatives works is the European Union as a bloc. So the way in which the burden is likely to be prioritized is on the larger countries who can afford to make that change. And when they can't, these smaller countries are likely to receive the most amount of subsidies to make that changeover happen in the first place. So I don't think the burden is going to happen in the way that opening government talks about. I think small countries are likely to be fine at the point in which they're doing this. The second thing is that they say, well, countries like you want to do this will already do this. I think they give a lot of analysis that is already self-mitigating. If the majority of young voters want green policy, then why would you leave this policy in the first place? If there's already general political buy-in to this policy, why do you need to do it as individual countries, given the entire bloc that already has a political consensus around this? Cool. Going into framing, which I think counters the framing that they say as to why climate change isn't very important. I think this policy is probably likely to be quite effective at stopping some of the effects of climate change, or at least prolonging the bunch of the effects that happen. Notably, because I think even if open government are like, well, the EU aren't the biggest producers, they are still a large producer of carbon. Even if you just take their population at face value, right? They have hundreds of millions of people that produce hundreds of millions of tons of carbon every single year. I think these all make a tangible effect in the climate crisis. There isn't a burden on opposition to say that this initiative stops climate crisis. Of course, there are other ways to which you can probably get other international buy-in for this. But notably, even if you just have the EU doing this is a substantial amount of carbon that if you're able to reduce, you're able to prolong the effects of climate change. So instead of the worst effects happening in 20 years, they now happen in 50 years. This means all the harms that you're likely to get, it means that the people that would have been harmed that period are no longer harmed. But also you probably mitigate the extent to which harm can happen in the first place, because you probably have new green tech during that period that you can probably safeguard from some of the effects, cleaning technology, etc., that we don't have right now. All these things will probably be capable within that time as well. So you're probably also preventing a bunch of that harm if you delay the effects of climate change even more. I think the effects of climate change are proximate to the European voter in conjunction with these other things for a few main reasons. One term is because in the long term, this is going to lead to large-scale economic disruption within the EU, i.e. the EU is dependent upon international supply chains, which will be affected in the short term from climate change, i.e. producer countries like Bangladesh, etc., that are literally being flooded right now. The ability for those countries to produce the goods the EU relies upon, consumer goods like food, like clothes, natural resources, all these things become a lot harder at the point in which these countries are affected by climate change. This increases the prices for consumers in the EU, which means that a lot of the effects of climate change will affect business, will damage economic productivity long term, and also affect the everyday EU citizen. But the second one is that natural disasters, and let's be honest, guys, OG is just well, you can just fix from the natural disasters. That doesn't stop. You can't fix people being dead, right, guys? The extremes of natural disasters that happen, they have been happening in recent years. Like in Germany, they have really harsh winters now within the past few years where they haven't had before. Literal people die every single time this happens. This is a huge harm. The EU probably wants to protect, because they have an obligation to protect their citizens, right, guys? They're politically accountable to these people to elect them in the first place, to buy into the policies, to make sure that the EU functions in the first place. The third one is internal economics, is that you have a lot of producers that rely upon weather patterns, like agricultural producers who need long-term stability in terms of the weather patterns they're likely to have. I think if you're able to mitigate some of those effects, it leads to less cases of large-scale agricultural failure within the EU. This affects a lot of EU citizens to the point which food probably gets more expensive. The people who have their livelihood depends upon the production of food also probably get fucked to the point in which this happens. I think for all these reasons, the climate crisis does affect EU citizens now and will continue to get worse as it gets into the future. Cool. Going into the case then on buy-in for larger policies. I think at the point at which you now move away from this policy, you lose a lot of legitimacy in the eyes of EU member states. I think for a few main reasons. One is that there's been, in the lead up to this policy being passed, there was a lot of discussions that was very key to election campaigns surrounding the EU policy. Some parties literally got in off the basis of this is a policy that would be beneficial to you. Put your faith in us. Now the EU is going back on that. These people are going back on their promises. The second one is business planning. Businesses have planned for this policy to be put in place in the first place. So probably built a load of contingencies, business plans, etc. that are contingent upon this policy actively happening. At the point at which you roll back this policy, it creates an element of risk because it creates uncertainty with business, i.e. there was a policy that was happening, now they're going back on it. I think it means that you are relatively unsure of the next policy the EU is likely to take, and this probably means that you're less likely to back further policy in the future when you feel that this policy is, that the actions that the EU is taking is likely to damage your business to the point which is creating this uncertainty. Before I go into the other mechanisms, I'll take closing if they have one. Or opening, go. Okay,
So
I
should we
tried.
just never change any plans at all if it's so detrimental to businesses and their planning and stuff?
Well, I think at the point which you've already committed to a plan, then yeah, I think that's a fine thing for us to stand by under off. I think the third and the most important one is that you look incompetent. The point is you've got buy-in to this policy in the first place. Lots of you've had to arrange with stakeholders this the policy is likely to be beneficial, and now you're saying to the EU, actually, guys, we fucked up. I think this means that backers towards the EU member states probably put less faith in the EU executive to actually know what they're doing to make plans that are likely to be good for the long term. I think the impacts of this are twofold. One is that you're less likely to get buy-in to large-scale policy. I think the EU probably does want to have larger policies to protect itself. Things that open government loves, things like the EU army to go to protect like the Ukraine, like buy into getting new members into the EU. So like, Ukraine if they win the war, but other states like Serbia, etc. And third, this is the most important one. At some point, given the analysis I've already given, you're going to have to buy onto a Green Deal because the effects of climate change get so severe. I think this means that at some point you need to have the buy-in to do a new deal further along the line, even if the EU can get away with not doing it right now. I think this means that when you have less buy-in to larger policies, people can point back to this policy that failed and be like, this is a stupid policy, it's less likely to fail. This is more likely to fail. I think this means that you're less likely to have buy-in to a deal when this deal is the most crucial in this debate. Alex will explain this later on. Thanks.
Thank the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. To conclude the OG case, Deputy Prime Minister to finish off on yellow.
Can you hear me? Yes, no, maybe?
Yeah, can.
Cool. So the thing that I want to note at the start of this speech is that opening government are really contingent on a lot of small countries acting in a very certain way. They are, however, never able to name any of these countries or explain where these countries are or what these countries look like. And I'm quite unclear as someone who lives relatively close to the EU as to what these countries actually look like and who these countries are. And I think that's quite an important thing for their case. So let's give you some context on the EU and how the countries within the EU actually act. Firstly, Croatia has just joined the EU because the EU offers a huge number of economic benefits to relatively small countries that they otherwise wouldn't have access to because they are reliant on the EU for making things like very big trade deals and allowing them access to that form of economic capital. And they really, really want to join. So I'm very unclear as to why these countries are suddenly going to be like, the climate change thing, and now are going to leave. But the second thing I want to know is that the countries that the opening government are talking about tend to be countries that are relatively production-based, i.e. lots of these countries don't have a service economy yet, meaning they're relatively reliant on things like agriculture, on things like production. The thing to note here then is that a lot of these countries are therefore the ones that are most impacted by climate change because climate change is the thing that tends to affect things like production and agriculture, as Zach has already explained. But the second thing to note is they go, opening government go, The thing is that these countries aren't affected by climate change. If anyone was in Bulgaria last summer, boy, it went really, really hot. But secondly, countries like Greece didn't have a winter last year. It never went below 10 degrees. A lot of these countries are incredibly affected by climate change and are affected by things like rising temperatures, meaning that you're less able to produce a lot of the goods that you'd want to in the first place because you're less able to do agricultural planning, you're less able to grow the same crops that you'd be used to growing for a large number of years, meaning you're just less able to produce the things that you produce in order to do good things. The second thing they say is, but we can just invest in other forms of green tech that are likely to protect these countries in the first place, i.e. we can put up flood walls and we can build greenhouses and all of these things. Firstly, I do think that green tech is on our side of the motion, but secondly, even so, the thing they say as to why this is the way we should do is that these things are cheaper and therefore more easy to do. I'm unclear as to why this policy is any cheaper than providing countries grants in order to be able to build things that are able to stop them doing as much climate emissions in the first place. This is relatively unclear. The second thing then is they say, but these small countries don't have the same amount of voice as, say, Germany. The thing about the EU, and this is pretty important, is that the countries within the EU all have equal voting rights, i.e. each country has one vote, meaning they are able to influence policy relatively easily. But secondly, I do just think that Germany probably aren't going, Croatia needs to do the same form of the same form of like preventative policy that we are, because I think these countries, they say, these countries just don't understand what the little countries are like. The little countries are still able to have a voice within politics, are still able to tell you what that is like within that country, and they're still able to say, here are the type of policy that we need in order to be able to mitigate climate change significantly. I think that just means that you are able to tailor policy specifically to these countries, especially at the point at which these countries tend to control the way in which this investment looks like, but secondly, tend to implement these policies in the first place, meaning that they are able to do the way that is most appropriate for their country anyway. So I think it's relatively useful as these small countries to be able to do these things anyway. And then the responses to our case that we get is, but they rolled back on the refugee policy, and this means that it's fine for them to roll back on other policies. Firstly, there was a huge amount of backlash when they rolled back on the refugee policy, but secondly, the refugee policy isn't the same level of political and economic planning, i.e. this policy has been in place for the last 4 years, and they have already implemented this within business planning, within agricultural planning, within city planning, because there's an increase in things like public transportation, all of these sorts of things, meaning that there is a huge amount to which this is already been implemented and is already relatively structural within the ways in which countries are planning their economies, but also just planning their ways in which they're able to mitigate climate change in the first place. Meaning that I think this is a very different policy to the refugee crisis, and therefore it's just a significantly different thing. I'm unclear as to why it's the same thing. So what happens at the point at which you roll back on this policy? Because I think that's probably quite important. Firstly, I just want to know, I do think this is probably able to reduce climate change to a relatively significant degree, because the EU is like the 4th biggest emitter of, maybe they're not the top 3, but they are the 4th biggest emitter of the gases in the first place. But secondly, I also just think that like, even if they're not, it is still something that they should do because this is the correct thing to do. And then they say, but America and India are going to do these things anyway. Just because I'm not the top serial killer in the world doesn't mean that I should like continue to kill people because it's all right because other people are doing it worse. I think it's important to just do the things that are correct. But also, I think it's a signaling effect. I think if the EU are like, no, we're going to roll back on our climate change policy in the first place, given that the EU has also historically done a lot that has increased climate change in the first place, I think just other countries are less likely to buy into these things. You probably get India and America doing less forms of like climate protectionism in the first place, and these things are all relatively bad. So then, what happens? I think you get just an increased amount of skepticism into what EU policy actually looks like and the ways in which people are willing to enact EU policy. I think there's just, when you roll back on a policy this large, firstly, businesses haven't been able to predict the ways in which their counterparts act, meaning they're less able to do things like stable investment because the markets then change relatively significantly at the point where you no longer have to do green policy. But secondly, I think it means that like just people on the ground now see that the EU have had to really roll back on a policy they've been very, very like politically loud about. Meaning that I think you just get less buy-in for significant policies into the future. I think it just increases a huge amount of skepticism within countries where skepticism is significantly more likely to increase, i.e. Germany or countries that feel that they can be sufficient outside of the EU because they have the economic capacity to do so. These are the countries that you do not want to be involving themselves in skepticism in the first place. These are the countries that you really, really don't want to leave the EU. This means I think when you increase skepticism within these countries, you are creating significantly more harm. Before I move on, does CG have a POI? No? OG? No? Okay.
Yes, I do, sorry. I really don't think that much of the developing world is going to care what the EU does one way or another, but like, even if they did, like, I really don't.
Okay. So the thing is, you say much of the developing world won't care. You said the USA and India. Like the USA is not, well, maybe some people think it's developing, but I would say that's probably, given it's one of the global superpowers, not a developing country. But I also think, like, even if the developing world don't care what the EU are doing, I think it still means that if you're emitting less carbon emissions, you probably are just reducing the impacts of climate change on that place in the first place, meaning that you're more able to access the goods that they're producing, which is probably a good thing. I think that the reason this is most important is, thirdly, the EU's main incentives is it wants to maintain itself. It wants to have the amount of political power it does. It doesn't want that political power to reduce in any way significantly. I think it also wants to be able to carry out policy. I think at the point in which you are more able to say that this is a policy that you've stood behind and a policy that like you believe in, I think you're just more able to carry that out relatively easily, given that the countries within the EU have to carry out the policy in order for it to be enacted. So I think that you probably just want these countries to carry this out properly. And like, lastly, climate change is an issue. It is going to continue to happen. And I think it's important that we're able to mitigate it now, rather than having to backslide and do this policy again in 10 years. Closing, I'm going to stand up and say some economicsy words, and then Arjun's going to rebut us for a few minutes. But ignore that and remember that you need to weigh an extension rather than just rebut your own.
All right. I thank the the yellow for that speech. Now let's introduce closing house, member of government.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Dear panel, this policy is hugely unpopular not only in the developing countries but in all people around the world who are contributing highly to the global emissions. So I think that instead of throwing trillions of dollars into the face of a crisis that can be solved because of the reasons given previously and which I would give you, we can see the immediate effects of this money being spent on better solutions and on policies that would actually save much more lives than would the climate change program would. So how does it happen? We see how the Green Deal doesn't have the effects that it should have. Why? Because we said already, we have countries that are the biggest emitters of these carbon emissions, and they wouldn't stop. Why they wouldn't stop? Because it's ideologically different difficult for them, because let's say they oppose the Western world. Russia, China, Iran, and all the countries in Africa are opposing these policies just because they are ideologically different. So uh, it is economically non-beneficial for them, just because we know that green energy is really expensive. We know that their economies would struggle to keep on growing and growing, which they want. All the countries from the east want their economies to continue their growth, because if they don't, they lose their pace and they would lose their strength to the other powers in the world that are challenging them, like the US and Europe. So we don't see how it would work for these countries, and they, even if they build some green energy, some panels and wind turbines, they're still building coal mines, they're still building coal plants, they're still using the same methods of same sources of energy, and it wouldn't stop uh, because they don't see it as reliable source of energy. Rather, they see as reliable sources like nuclear energy, which is considered green energy by the Green Deal, which is considered good by most of the world, even by China, by Russia, countries which build nuclear plants right now. So we see how there are green policies that are accepted by most of the world, but are not developed enough in order to replace the technology that we know right now. Instead of uh, giving so much money for something that is not accepted by everyone, by something that we don't even know, we are not sure if it would work in the long term, if it would give any other effects in future. We are sure that if we give these high amounts of money to poor countries in order to save the hungry children that are there are hundreds of millions of people who are starving in the world right now, and if we don't provide them any support, and they're dying. So we see how the immediate effects of poverty and of non-supporting these countries are affecting us, but we can see the certain effects of giving so much money for something that is something that would not work. The problem is binary. Either we solve it and the world is saved, or we don't. But the chances of the climate change being stopped are really low. The chances of this climate change to continue are almost certain. And we see how instead of we see how we are just throwing money at the problem instead of trying to find solutions about it. And the solutions that are certain are namely nuclear, new researches for new technologies that would replace the main sources of sources of energy, which are the main pollutant in the world, because some company the industry uses them, the people use them. So we see how this can be changed. The alternative is to see the immediate effect of this money instead of wasting them. Okay, POI.
Okay, citizens are naturally averse to nuclear energy because of the history of nuclear disasters that's seen as a proximate threat. Things like Chernobyl, things like Fukushima. I think people probably don't buy into nuclear over green.
Almost the whole world, developing and developed world believes in nuclear, just because this technology is much more safer now. We are seeing how countries such as countries in Europe and in the developing world are building nuclear plants because they know it's much more safer now, and these two accidents have not made a really big of an impact to so many people as poverty and hunger and famine does. So nuclear plants are almost everywhere in the developed countries, and in the developing countries, US have it, Europe has it, China has it, India, Russia, everyone believes in nuclear energy, much or less. So and if we think that most of the countries agree on pursuing new types of energy and investing in science research into investigating, let's say, thermonuclear energy and other sources of reliable and sustainable energy, it would give it has larger chance to give an impact and to achieve our aims, instead of something that is not reliable at all. Poverty and hunger can be solved by giving the poor countries and the countries in need and the people in need what they want. Otherwise, everything, some innocent lives would be wasted.
I thank the member of government for that speech. Now to introduce the member of opposition.
Can I be clearly heard?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. POI is in the chat, please. RJ, let me. Starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. First extension of is completely. 2, why the most important threat to buy into EU policies is not flip-flop, it's the short-term threat of populism, and why the Green Deal is uniquely good at dealing with this. First of all, on effectiveness. I think it's important to characterize that doing this through the EU is better than through other countries. On government, we get presumably a lot of analysis of why. One, countries are likely to accept some sort of like green technology insofar as they have threats. It's unclear why the EU is specifically better than other countries at this point in the debate. Therefore, we need analysis. 2, if there's young voters who want this, it's unclear why it won't happen through countries or why it happening through countries is bad compared to the deal. Why is the EU better than countries? 4 independent reasons. First, bilateral cooperation between countries will lead to probably you not cutting as much on emissions, having exemptions on certain types of car, and leaving stuff on the table. Why is this true? Notice that when two countries negotiate with each other, there is a problem of a public good provision. That is, if one continues to cooperate, you as a country get some benefits from reducing the total number of emissions. However, these benefits are the same if you, country B, for example, Austria cooperates with Germany. If Germany does cut back on emissions, Austria has an incentive to not cut on emissions because they get some benefit from Germany cutting down, and they can continue doing stuff that's not green that nevertheless is good for the economy. Why doesn't this happen to the EU, and why do countries accept more stringent terms under this deal? One, the EU has more policy areas. That is, if you lose out on the environment, the EU literally has the biggest fund to give to countries in Eastern Europe for rebuilding in agriculture, for creating new industries, for allowing you bigger market access and more exemptions for the goods you produce and you sell more to Western Europe because it's your closest trade partner. Insofar as you can get side benefits, countries are willing to accept deals from the EU. This can't happen between countries because obviously countries cooperate in less policy areas than the EU and they can get this. The second thing is that compliance is just much better. The EU ties a lot of the Green Deal to funding it already gives, and it creates incentives for countries to go for it. For example, the Renew Europe thing after COVID, you can get added funds as a country if you do net zero construction of a certain number of buildings, which is adjusted for each country. Insofar as if you don't do this, you lose out on funds. There's an added incentive when you do it through the EU to do stuff good. Third reason, oftentimes, if it's true that countries are poor and people are unemployed, oftentimes building a lot of solar panels costs too much. The startup cost is too big, and individual countries, especially the ones in Eastern Europe, who, by the way, are more affected, as Paul says, by climate change because they're agricultural, they can never get into the green path because they don't have the startup capital to start. The good thing about the EU is that there's countries that earn significantly more from their economies in the West that contribute significantly more. And this beats the problem of high startup costs because the EU can subsidize part of these costs. And this is why the countries can go into green and we have effectiveness. The final reason is just that the EU will do better than individual countries. It's prestigious to work in the EU, and the EU is often better funded than a lot of countries in Europe. So the best experts are likely to be in Brussels and they know the most things. But two, the Commission will be kind of sad if it proposes a policies and countries are like, this is dog shit, I don't want to cooperate with you, because they get the reputational hit. So they're only likely to give the best amount of policy that is likely to be accepted. For all these reasons, the policy is relatively good and achieves the maximal thing the European Union can do, and thus we get all the benefits of reducing climate change. I also want to characterize that they're big, not only because the EU is the fourth, but notice that the EU is kind of rich compared to the rest of the world, and they generate a lot of the global demand. So if people in Europe cannot buy a car made in Bangladesh or something made unsustainably in Thailand, this probably has trickle-down benefits to the whole of the world insofar as Europe is very populated, a lot of consumers, and probably more consumers than China or other countries, and therefore it has a bigger impact. Second, moving on into effectiveness of policy. O tells us that buying goes down because there's flip-flop on policy. One, I just think like countries don't care about this. Remember in 2008 when they flip-flopped on the euro, which is literally the currency of all the countries and the thing these countries care most about? People still continued operating with the EU because there's benefits outside of the things that the flip-flop happens. Common industrial policy, common standards on innovation, easier to sell your patents, etc. The biggest harm now is that uniquely in 2024 and the following years, there's a large chance for populist parties to come into power because things like the tractor protests are happening now because like there's less funding into agriculture and farmers are relatively angry. Refugees are coming now from the wide range of global conflicts and people are afraid for the jobs now. There's skepticism now. The problem with this is that if populists get in the short term, it becomes progressively harder to create any sort of policy because they can veto it, they can water it down. Even if like flip-flopping is a massive impact from O, it only happens once and over time people forget. When populists get into power and people who vote populists see that they
Thanks for the ref to OO, but in your best case, we're totally fine with slightly less efficient climate change initiatives happening through countries because we're totally
Why do we get better stuff for the small countries? One, notice that a lot of industry has gone down in these countries due to pressures from China and etc. But you notice that a lot of these poor countries are flat. They have big potential for building windmills, solar panels, etc. With this policy, you create a lot of employment because you have to build an industry to build these things. You have to build the new power plants. It's a lot of employment, and people on the ground angry that they're losing their job to immigrants or to external economic pressure get the jobs and they stop supporting populist parties. Two, the EU has cut taxes a lot because it wants to attract new businesses. Energy providers who are now taxed more for fossil fuels are presumably have big profits, so the big taxation can go towards the people. But thirdly, energy resilience is bigger now that you have domestic sources, or at least you have a bigger pool of energy. This outweighs more because if there's a problem with developing with like less developed countries in the EU not getting their full benefits, they get more from this plan, and this is unique. Proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition. Now to introduce Government to end the Gov's
Okay. So I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. So I don't see how the CEO says that when creating more of these energy sources, green energy sources, you create more workforce, and people wouldn't be that pissed off when they have immigrants coming to your country and taking your work. I don't see how this is working because in Bulgaria there was a huge scandal when almost 1 billion euros were given to Bulgaria and 50 workers were employed for sustaining these solar panels that were bought with that 1 billion. So it doesn't create that much of a workplaces for people not to be pissed off. It doesn't create that much energy that is sustainable that is good for sustaining an economy large like Germany and etc. Because Germany opened their coal plants and now they are using coal in order to produce energy, and we see how this is completely unsustainable in a moment in which you don't have that security by the other major sources of energy, such as nuclear, such as gas, and other sources. I don't see how how cooperation between countries in order to implement the green policies, the example with Austria and Germany, works because it doesn't work outside of the EU. Germany can give money to whoever it wants, but outside of EU it wouldn't do it. Nobody would give money to some countries in Africa to build solar panels just because it would create disrupt in the societies of these countries, and it would give power to the populist parties which want namely this. They want to see how your country gives money to other countries, gives how it weakens by these unreliable sources and by these actually unpopular policies that are made in these countries. So we see only the effect of right-wing parties taking into power more and more often, which I think which was opposed by the CEO. They would take more and more power just because you create more and more green policies which are unpopular, which because people believe that their countries are made weak by these unreliable sources and by this expensive energy. Much rather than people in France which have nuclear energy, which 80% of the energy is provided by nuclear, and people are not concerned about their energy supply just because they have 300 something nuclear reactors, and their country is not afraid of nuclear explosion at all. Why? Because it's completely secure and new technologies are developed, much rather than the technologies that were developed 100 years ago. So if such technologies which were developed through history should be implemented, and they are developed to become more and more secure. These technologies can be everything but secure. Some POI, I see. POI.
No. So closing opposition, rebut our mechanisms, and then provide one additional one in form of an extension. This is not an extension. Please engage.
I think it is an extension because, you see, we provide you with the fact that we have on our side of the house, we have an immediate results when we give money to people who need them. If the EU can rather give the money that are provided for the Green Deal to countries in Africa just because to provide them with support in building schools, with building hospitals, with providing food for families. This is much rather possible because if you give, let's say, $100 million to some country in Africa, even if 50% of this money go to corruption and some other things, and not most of them go to the purpose they have, they will have some impact. There would be impact on our side of the house, and it is certain. We have the certain impact, which is creating more hope to people, creating just helping people survive, helping countries develop in their domestic affairs, rather than just giving money to some imaginative aims that would not be met, and we think that our impacts in the short term are more important, just because the impacts on their side of the house are not certain at all. We'd rather have some short-term impacts rather than none. If we give more money about the things that we said in our speech, about nuclear, about food, about the development of these countries, we would have some type of impact, rather than they would have none on their side of the house. Thank you.
Right. I thank the Gov Whip to conclude this debate at its full. Stop.
Hi, just checking. Am I audible?
Yes.
Great. Okay. POIs in the chat, please. Non-verbally. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, I'm going to quickly deal with closing government, move on to opening government, and then finally weigh the 2 extensions we brought to you against our opening bench. Very quickly then on closing government, there are 2 main things I want to point out that I think nicely take them out. The main extension, well, quote unquote extension we get coming up are largely speculative, which is why it doesn't make sense to continue to pour money into this compared to the certain backlash that we get when we do things like anger poor countries. Government realized there's research that needs to take place before the Green New Deal was even vetted to begin with. You can't just allow people to pour money into policy that has no certain benefits. And here's where I'd like to note, right? Mitigation of climate change is a benefit. We don't need to solve the entire crisis as a whole. And for that reason, that is what allows people to continue putting money into the Green New Deal. So no, it's just a false claim to say that the Green New Deal has no benefits whatsoever. We are seeing a positive trend. The second thing they just say is that nuclear energy is really good. Just like believe this however much you want. Like if it's true that the benefits are so amazing, presumably you can just include that in the Green New Deal too. I think we're fiat to counterprop to a certain extent as well. Okay, closing government out the way. Moving on to opening government. Three things I want to talk about here. The first thing I want to ask is the Green New Deal overly punitive on smaller countries? And note this is a bulk of the case. Two things to note here. One, this claim is contingent on there just being absolute impoverished countries in the EU who are going to be fucked over as a result of the Green New Deal. But just, I want you to note, right, that in order for many countries to join the EU to begin with, you needed to do things like prove you can have a minimum member contribution of your GDP. So at the very least, there's some baseline level of economic prosperity of these member states. It's not like they're languishing in absolute poverty and you're punishing them as a result of the Green New Deal. But the second and more important claim is, this is just asserted. Yes, maybe there's starving people in Eastern Europe and Bulgaria, but that's not a reason as to why they have zero capacity to conduct any green transition whatsoever. Because if this was the case, OG is equally as fucked over, because how are these countries going to be the ones who can independently conduct their own climate change policy as they want them to do so? But Stefan's extension solves this in two ways. One, we showed you, even if it's true that there are poor countries, the EU has structural funds to help these poor countries correct the deficit in terms of the resources they have to join the Green New Deal and actually engage in this policy. Secondly, like any other multilateral body, there's the capacity for the EU to shoulder different economic burdens. It's obviously intuitive that larger countries and powerhouses like Germany and France are going to fund the majority of it because they recognize, because of things like colonialism and the fact they enjoyed a fuck ton of resources, they're more better equipped to do things like spearhead the fight against climate change compared to smaller poor countries like Bulgaria and other countries in Eastern Europe. So it's not like we're leaving these countries in the dust. There is a way for them to join the Green New Deal. So just don't buy the OG assertion that these countries are going to be entirely fucked over underneath the model. Secondly, are the impacts of abandoning the Green New Deal significant? And I'd like you to note, if you want to buy this claim coming up from opening government, you need to buy their climate science denial to a certain extent, because their case is just woefully untrue, like in terms of what the status quo looks like. Western Europe is literally sinking because it's a flat land. There are floods in Central Europe because the Alps are melting with each year as temperatures rise up. So no, the problem isn't something small, something you can just build a seawall and pretend like it no longer exists. Mitigation is actually quite difficult to do on the side of opening government for two reasons. One, the key problem is that there's a lack of independent renewable energy networks. You're highly dependent on outer sources of energy, and for that reason, you need to build a lot of infrastructure to correct the gap. Secondly, a lot of Europe's infrastructure was built in the 1800s, so a vast amount of updating is needed. You can't just put an aircon unit into a building and pretend that things are going to get better. You need to do things that actually build new houses, because the materials used back then are just not going to be good for those in the status quo. So this is why you can't just mitigate the problems of climate change and opening government and pretend everything is good. The last thing I want to talk about is it possible for countries to conduct their own independent climate change policy? And here's where I like to note, opening government's own analysis bites them in the ass here. If it's true there's starving people in countries like Eastern Europe, governments aren't even going to put money into climate change to begin with, so you get no climate change policy on their side as opposed to some marginal policy on our side. Secondly, their burden isn't just defending the abandonment of the policy and pretending that things get better, because as the crisis worsens, you need to table new policy anyway, but it gets far worse than when pollution is entrenched on their side and people are more hesitant to pivot. Thirdly, even in the best case, Stefan highlights the public good problem exists, where insofar as if some countries cut down, I can continue polluting because it means that I continue to get benefits. That is, if some countries like the Netherlands doing climate change policy, the effects of it are neutralized by the fact that countries in Central and Eastern Europe continue to pollute. So there's no net change on the side of opening government. If anything, it gets far worse. And here's why you can't just concede a little bit. People dying in the future. This isn't a small benefit that's negligible in the greater context of the debate. Before I move on, sure, opening government.
Okay, you say that if we pollute less, other people can pollute more. I feel like by your own analysis, this means that China, the US, India will just see this as an excuse to take less of their share, and you won't get any of your impacts anyway. I mean, if what you say is
So
true anyway.
confused. Like, China has independent reasons to be the front runner of climate change, regardless of what the EU does. They want to get more developing countries on their side to turn away from the US. The US also wants to battle against the reputation of China. So they're not just going to cut down on emissions if the EU is going to do a bulk of it. I'm not sure where the PY is going. Lastly, let's see what opening opposition. One, O's main argument is just that climate change is bad and the GND helps correct this. Unfortunately, as Stefan explains, there's no mechanization as to why specifically the EU as an institution can do this well. And we corrected this through 3 ways. One, there's institutional expertise. So you're able to collaborate, share resources and information to actually correct a lot of the gaps and lack of expertise that smaller countries have. Secondly, you have things like resource sharing. The EU has a fuck ton of money to do things like fund smaller projects in these poorer countries. And the most importantly, there's political bargaining and negotiating. The only way you lure smaller countries into it is with the promise of more benefits and other alternate economic policies in the future that aren't tied to climate change. Secondly, in terms of dealing with backlash, right? So the argument about lost legitimacy is largely speculative, but what we told you for certain was that politicians can weaponize on the continuation of this policy to do bad, but uniquely, it's the extension of this policy that actually deals with the Euroscepticism. Because one, the Green New Deal transition necessitates an overhauling of the industry. So not only do you have people driving research, you also have individuals who work in the factories to now do things like build solar panels, build windmills, so they still get jobs on our side. Lastly, things like the Green New Deal is also good for national security. The Russian war highlighted how being energy dependent is bad. We now correct this on our side. For those reasons, side with you.
Right. Thank Opweb. Give me 10 to 15 minutes. I will whip up an OA in time. I don't know if Wings have to give feedback. I'll just ask